To say that HB1 is problematic is probably the understatement of this century. The true intent of this bill is to have a chilling effect on those who would protest racial discrimination. It creates 6 new criminal offenses, which are wholly unnecessary. If all of us on this call were to roll out and have a protest, we're entitled to do that peacefully. But if we pop off and start tearing down things and tearing up things, it's not like we just walk away from that with immunity right now, right? Like, you're not allowed to riot right now. But what this bill does is create, like I said, 6 new criminal offenses, wholly unnecessary. This is punishable by up to a year in prison. It basically says that if a group of 3 or more tries to compel others by force or threat of force, what does that even mean? But by threat of force, to do something or assume or abandon a viewpoint, that is mob intimidation. What is troubling to me there is, like I said, protest is the language of the unheard. So if I feel unheard and I'm out there protesting and I'm saying, government, please stop killing me just for walking down the street or wearing a hoodie or eating Skittles or just whatever it is. And I'm doing that with 2 or more of my friends, right? Because it's a group of 3 or more. That could be deemed mob intimidation because my friends and I seem threatening to you. There are 2 infractions for memorials. One is for destroying a memorial and then damaging a memorial. If you destroy a memorial, that's punishable by up to 15 years in prison. So that's destroying or pulling down a memorial. We know that this is directed at protecting Confederate monuments. If you damage a memorial, that's punishable by up to 5 years in prison. Talking felonies, folks. There's a new crime for cyber intimidation, which, if I'm honest, this part actually isn't so bad because I don't think anybody should be taking someone's personal information and putting it up on a website, just to be a bully. I think that actually is maybe the one slightly redeeming part of this bill, but the rest of it is so bad, like you can't even save it. Aggravated riot, which is punishable by up to 5 years in prison. They say that a riot is something that includes at least 10 people or displays deadly weapons or endangers traffic by force or threat of force, or causes more than $5,000 in property damage, or causes great bodily harm to a non-participant. Right now, like I gave the example, if we were to go and we're protesting peacefully, but then something pops off and it turns violent, there are already laws on the books that would, say that our behavior is criminal and we're subject to penalty. Now they want to say an aggravated riot, which basically just enhances that penalty. If you have the time, and it doesn't have to take that long, if you could maybe take a look on the Florida House website, if there are Republican lawmakers in your areas, because so far, basically, this bill has come down to party line votes. But if there are Republican lawmakers in your area, think about picking up the phone and giving their office a call. Whether you speak with them or with their staff, they still should be logging that and express why it's problematic to you. If you have a story about what it was like for you being out there in a protest, or maybe a friend being out there in a protest, or how traumatized you were, to the extent maybe you were, like I was, when I watched everything happen last summer, that's powerful. And I'm not saying excuse the bad behavior. I think it's time out for that sort of polite tolerance that we have for some of these views that get cloaked in conservatism, but actually are not based in fact at all. I think it is important to call things out as inaccurate. But when we're trying to build consensus, you have to understand you may not get everything that you want, and that's okay. Think about how you define success. You also have to recognize sometimes there's a principle in organizing: no permanent enemies, no permanent allies, meaning that you never know where you can find support. Sometimes it might come from unlikely places, but if you're too focused, too much in the echo chamber, you might miss your opportunity to have support.
So, as you all know, the pandemic has really hit Florida. They hit it with an unprecedented public health crisis that exposed and worsened social inequality. It triggered an economic recession, and it's left the state with a pretty big financial challenge ahead. And the one arena where this will have to come up is the state budget. And the reason that I say it's that it's gonna come up, it's because when session starts, which started today, the one thing that legislators have to do is pass a budget. They don't have to do anything else, but by law, they have to pass a balanced budget. So it's important for us to kind of, understand that. Now, as they return to Tallahassee, as policymakers, the questions of how to best deal with the budget, how to balance it, will come up. Therefore, our goal today is just to walk through some of the fundamentals of the budget process here in our state, so that when we go to the Capitol, we can contribute to the conversation and we can understand where people are coming from. So to start, I want to just bring this idea to your attention. The idea that we can't speak of better budgeting without talking about who wins, who loses, or demonstrating that no one is losing. But we have to think of that. And with that, I kind of just want to pause for a moment and just throw a question at you. What does the budget tell us? I'll give you 20 seconds for anyone if you want to put it in the chat, or just, I think we have a small group so we can get off mute if we want. What does it do? Priorities, I heard that, yeah. Oh, I'm drinking a little coffee. What else does it tell us? But I 100% agree, it does tell us where our priorities lie.
And I think that by default, it gives us some glimpse of how the future may look like.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Who's actually being listened to? Yeah, because not everyone has a voice. Although in a perfect budget, we would all have a say, but sometimes not everyone gets a voice in the process. Priorities, who's listened to, a glimpse of the future. All of those things are things that we do see in the budget, that the budget tells us. Anything else that we can think of? How we generate revenue. In a sense, and we will talk about that, it tells us how we spend the revenue and the revenue that we're generating, right? So it's all that spending, but definitely. Sometimes it shows us what the majority party does, kind of where their priorities, connecting that back in, lie, right? But in all of this, what we should be thinking about, right, and we are, is that the budget has consequences. Alexandra mentioned that it has like long-term effects, right? The future, it does. So when we think about the budget, we really should be approaching it from a lens of, let's say, critical empathy, of thinking about the impact of the budget, not just on the majority, but others, the minority, on everyone else in our communities. What is the impact of this? And we should approach it with that critical empathy, which is exactly what we're doing right now. Now, the budget doesn't exist in a vacuum. Just from your comments, that's clear. It has a real impact on people, has a real impact on communities, and it outlines a series of choices. Those priorities are choices about what kind of services our government should provide and what Floridians are entitled to as members of our society. Those are the choices that policymakers are making every year when they make our budget. And beyond that list, just beyond a list of spending items, of priorities, we could say that the budget is really a record of our values. A year to year. If we want to see what we value as a state, what we hold dear, we would just look at the budget. Where's our money going? What are we funding? What are we not funding here from year to year? And this is just a little, not too technical, right? But it's the idea of the budget as a plan. The budget describes what we do in the state, how we spend money. That's the revenue part. It connects everything that we want to do with the money that's available to do those things. And that's in terms of balance, because we have to pass a balanced budget. The budget limits spending to the amount of revenue, so there's a revenue component, the amount of revenue that we have available. And this prevents overspending, and it continues that balance that we have to have. Essentially, a good budget will say something like, hey, these are what we believe are the operating conditions right now, and here's what we plan to do if any problems of opportunities arise. Now, these predictions may not come true 100%, but at least if they do, we have the budget, we have the strategic plan there to deal with them. So there's a strategic component. And that kind of raises another question that I wanted to just bring to everyone. And that is, how is this kind of budgeting that we're talking about, this public sector budgeting, how is that different from your own personal budgeting? Or let's say from a business budget? How will we say that the public sector budget is different, if at all? They are definitely.
The process may be to decide what will be in the budget. When it is something personal, it's just you deciding. Whereas if it's something public, then it
Yeah.
takes time. You have to vote to see who wants that to be included or not.
Yeah. So on a personal budget, you would be deciding for yourself. So you're the one stakeholder making those decisions. This one, you're going to have to compromise. Representative Driscoll talked a little about that, how you find a compromise. There was the idea you're using someone else's money. It's not your money that you're dealing with. This is the tax, but this is everyone's money, the community's money. Someone said my personal aim would be to make a profit, which also kind of mirrors budgeting in the private sector, in the business. The idea is to make a budget, and you would do that. In the public sector, it's not so much. And it may exclude personal endeavors. It is, yeah. So those are key differences between the public sector budget and our personal budget. Another component is that it is other people's money, and because of that, it's also a really big budget. We're talking billions of dollars, right? I think the last budget was like 90 billion plus. That's a lot of money. I don't have 90 billion. If I did, I don't know, but I don't. Anyway, so that's really, I want to bring some kind of other differences here, but one big difference that we all talked about because we have a conversation about HB1 is the idea of public policies. It's a public document, and public policies a lot of the times dictated. So again, it's not so much dictated by our own personal choices. There's going to be some public policy that require money. And in public budgeting, more often than not, these ideas, these policies will precede the numbers. And that's something that's pretty unique. In fact, if you don't have these ideas, if you don't have these public policies, oftentimes the numbers are meaningless. So we should be thinking about that because it opens the door, or at least an opportunity for us to bring in policies that we want funded, kind of deal. We should approach the budget process through a sense of civic duty and an opportunity to lead with our values and bring equitable policies so that we can create equitable budgets. So all this idea of getting involved, which you are doing, is just part of that. And you shouldn't be dissuaded from getting involved in the budget. The other aspect which we talked about is that the budget is for the community. It's other people's money. It's the primary means by which policymakers address the needs of Floridians. So again, if we want to see those values, let's see how we're spending money. It's the primary means that we take those policy plans and we make them into action. So ideally, we want equitable policies, not policies that overstep or, like HB1, they take away constitutional rights. Another aspect, and this is what I have on the screen, that makes it very different from private sector budgeting is the use of funds. And this is something you're going to encounter in these conversations. And funds are just separate accounts for separate purposes. So even though it's different from personal budgeting, just think about it. If you have a checkings account and a savings account, those are your two different funds. And when you're making purchases, usually they're coming from the checkings account and it doesn't draw from your savings automatically. In fact, you would have to go and make a transfer. So in that respect, fund accounting is actually pretty similar, except that when we're talking about the government, the public sector budget, the funds are really big and there's a bunch of them. Each one of these funds has their own laws. They all have to have revenue that's equal to their expenditures or the spending, so they have to be balanced. And just to show you, this pie on screen speaks to kind of like how much of the budget is broken up by funds. The general fund is the pink one, and that's the one that you probably want to be thinking about. It's the largest kind of standalone fund. The other ones, when you hear federal trust funds, those are just different funds that have federal money in it, different accounts with federal money in it. And the state trust funds are just different accounts with state money in it. But the one that has the most flexibility, the one where most of the general revenue, so when we think of revenue in the state, that's what? Sales taxes. Those sales tax dollars are going to go into the general revenue fund, and that's going to give you the most flexibility. So when you talk about budgeting, that's usually the fund that people are going to be talking about the most. And it's the one that gives you the most flexibility. That's our checking account in this sense, right? The other thing that's kind of different is the process. And I just right now, the planning for the fiscal year that's coming up, it's already underway, this idea of the planning. And the fiscal year is something you're going to see. In Florida, the fiscal year begins July 1st and ends June 30th. So when you see fiscal year, that's what they're talking about. It's just a period that helps in record keeping, tax collection, spending, and general financial management. So for the year that's coming up, that's going to kick off July 1st, 2021, and it's going to end June 30th, 2022. And all the policymakers are going to be planning for that. Now, before the start of any fiscal year, you have the governor, you have agency heads, policymakers, interest groups, the courts, and the public. They all have a role to play in the whole process. And one way that we can sum up the process, and this is not kind of like a 100% formula, but it's a pretty good formula. We can use this abbreviation, PLE, P, preparation, L, legislative approval, E, executive implementation, and then A, auditing, right? So just to kind of show you where we are in the process, everything kicks off July 15th. The governor gives instructions on how to make the budget, and he sends it to the agencies, or he or she sends it to the agencies. It kicked off July 15th. And then you're gonna have access to this, but just to show you some of the key dates. All of this goes until the hold up, I'll come back to that. Until the governor submits his recommended budget. And that's something that just came out a month ago. So the governor submits his recommended budget, and then the legislature will take that and they'll use it as a framework, but it's not gonna be one-to-one. But that's the preparation phase. It all kind of comes up to the governor's budget. After that, it takes us to what we're doing now. And what's gonna happen now is the legislature, both the Senate and the House, they're gonna have to come up with their own versions of the budget. And then when they come up with their own versions of the budget, they're gonna have to negotiate any differences. And eventually, after those differences are negotiated, that's when we'll get the General Appropriations Act. And that's the main budget. So it's all gonna happen now in session. It just started, and they have until May to come up with this. And that's our legislative approval phase. After that, you get the executive. And what they'll do is they'll send it over to the governor. And the governor gets the option to veto any of it. If the legislature is not happy with the vetoes, they can use a 2/3 majority to override it. So that is possible. And then the last thing, this takes us to June. This becomes law once it's passed July 1st. And then after that, there's an auditing process for the previous year. And then the cycle starts again. So you have that preparation phase, which ends with the governor's budget. You have the legislative approval phase that we're in now, finally executive phase, and then just auditing. And that takes us through the whole process, right? So when you go to the Capitol, we're gonna be in the middle of that legislative phase. And what I've included here for you later are just kind of like some definitions. And I'll send this to everyone. You're probably gonna encounter some of these words later on, so you wanna be comfortable with them. And I can answer questions about them, but I think I've talked a lot. So I'll pause here. If we have any questions, again, you're gonna be receiving all of this. I also have my contact information up here, but I think this opens it up for questions or just more conversation, and I can cover anything. I know a lot of content, but yeah. All right, I'll stop sharing right now.
Thank you, Esteban. Yeah, feel free to ask any questions of Esteban. Dr. Santis, I apologize. I see Lynn Purcell actually has an interesting comment in the chat about like where she sees, investments, where she sees investments being made. So I don't know if you have time, it's a little long, but to address that. And then like anyone else, feel free to come off mute just like we did for the last speaker and ask your question, or feel free to use the chat.
What kind of public, actually, you're right. So Lynn mentioned, I only see streets being revamped in poor communities right before the election. And that's for the most part when they need resources. They travel to those communities. So it's possible that we will see difference just like getting home. So I think oftentimes people use the budget as a political tool just to get kind of acceptance and whatnot. And I think that's beneficial only because people aren't that involved. So I think a lot of this is about raising awareness of the budget process and how we can get involved so that people are not wielding it for political aims, but it's truly a public process. And that ties into the next question, right? What kind of public engagement, if any, is done with the state budget process? Right now, if you look at the budget, it's like a 500+ page document. It's not very accessible. It's not very accessible to the public at all. When the legislature passes the GAA, right before it goes to the governor, there's going to be a cooling off period. During that period, and I think it's 72 hours, it might be 48, so I gotta double check. But during that period, the public should have some say. That gives everyone a chance to read it. But again, we're talking about a 500-page document. That's supposed to give everyone a time to read it and throw in their opinion. I think right now what we need to do is we need to kind of reevaluate the way that we engage the public, and this is one way to do it. So this is Kiddos Miami is doing a wonderful job here, but we need to have more events like this where we talk about it, because right now the process itself is very inaccessible. But a lot of the engagement that you're doing, that's one way, just talking about the budget. When you get a chance, can you talk about the Sadowski Trust Funds? That's the housing fund. So going into this budget, you're going to hear a lot of conversations about a revenue shortfall. And that's true. Because of the pandemic, we have been in an economic recession and we don't have a lot of money. It's like $2.75 billion that are going to need to be made up. But to address that, there's different options. One option that I'm a big proponent of is finding revenue. We have revenue options. We should be finding revenue. And one way to do that is through progressive taxes. People who have the ability to pay the wealth, they should pay a little more in taxes. Corporations closing corporate tax loopholes. Another strategy that I'm not a big fan of is what we call trust fund sweeps. So when I mentioned those different accounts, you have your checking account, you have your savings account. Well, we have in the state, we have trust funds, which are different accounts. Think of just other savings accounts for very specific purposes. And if you don't have money, you could take money from there and bring it to your general revenue. The problem with that is that you're taking money away, in this example, for housing projects, you're taking money away from affordable housing to fill in a budget gap. And then what that does, that creates future problems for the housing trust fund, because you took money away from there. Now, how are they going to address affordable housing in the future? That's that issue. So we have different trust funds that really are for a specific purpose. But if we get to a position where we need revenue, instead of raising revenue, what they oftentimes have done in this case is take money from the Sadowski Trust Fund to put into general revenue. I hope that kind of explains it a little.